This season of the Creative Piano Teaching Podcast is proudly brought to you by Casio Electronic Music Instruments.
The students who played their instruments for longer were the ones who practiced more. And the students who received more support from their parents were the ones who practiced more, and therefore they played their instruments longer. So more parental support equals more practice, which equals sticking at your instrument longer, which means you ultimately have music in your life.
Welcome to the Creative Piano Teaching Podcast, the place where teachers from around the world meet to share innovative ideas about music education. Listen and learn as we help you motivate your students, grow your income, expand your studio, and become a more creative piano teacher.
Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Creative Piano Teaching Podcast. You're listening to episode number 123. This is season 1, episode 7. We've only got 2 episodes to go in this season, and I do hope you've been enjoying things so far. My name is Tim Topham, your host for the show, and if you're one of my Inner Circle piano teaching community members, a very special welcome to you. Whether it's your first time listening or you're a long time listener of the show, again, thank you. It really means a lot to me that you're taking this time to listen, and I really do hope I can continue to provide you lots of value. The Creative Piano Teaching Podcast is the place where you can get your weekly hit of inspiration, ideas, business, and teaching strategies to help support your teaching and grow your studio. Today's show notes, transcript, links, images, everything you need is now available at timtopham.com/episode 123. So we've started already our 3-part series on music motivation with the fantastic Samantha Coates. So I won't go to the trouble of introducing her again because you've already got to know her, I hope. We're just going to go straight into today's conversation, and we're looking at parent motivation and the impact of motivating parents that can have on your students. We've got lots of great ideas coming your way. So here it is, my interview, part 2 with Samantha Coates. Samantha Coates, welcome back to part 2.
Thank you, Tim. It's great to be back.
So this is part 2 in our motivation series with the fabulous Samantha Coates. Last week, we looked at overscheduled kids and we talked about the motivation matrix, intrinsic rewards, extrinsic rewards, all that good stuff. So I'd encourage anyone listening to this episode who hasn't listened to that one to head back and check that out. That's episode 123. And of course, remember, you can always listen to these easily on my app on Google or App Store. Just search for Tim Topham. Today, we're exploring how parents affect the motivation of students and how we really need to consider them in the mix when considering how motivated our students are. So, Samantha, what made you realize that we can't ignore parents when it comes to student motivation?
Well, the main reason is that the parents are in charge of the child's life in 99% of cases. And if we haven't got the parent on board, or if the parent thinks that they can just drop their child off and it's all up to the teacher and nothing further needs to happen at home, then it doesn't work. It's not an activity. It's not just going to drawing for half an hour. It's not that. It takes so much consolidation throughout the week that the parent must understand their role in being supportive. And there are different ways that parents can offer support. Some are able to offer more support than others, but if we don't engage them and have them present in the parent-student-teacher triangle, then music as a pursuit is far less successful.
Right. And we talked about this last week in part 1 in regard to the difference between gyms and ballets and dance classes and those kinds of and sport teams, because the parents can drop them off and the kid can just do the sport team sessions 3 times a week and come home and they don't have to do anything. We've got to educate them, don't we, about the fact that it is a real collaboration and that triangle is so important.
Yes, it is. It's essential. And in fact, there's an Australian guy named Gary McPherson, Dr. Gary McPherson, who did a 14-year longitudinal study in Sydney of 157 music students. He got them from the week before they received their band instruments, and some of them did start learning piano, and followed most of them for 14 years.
Whoa, wow.
Yes, and the main summary that comes through in his book, which is called Music in Our Lives, which is a fantastic book, is that mostly it's not the child that gives up music, it's the parent.
Right. So say that again, because that's interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. It's not the child who gives up music, it is the parent. When the parent has had enough of driving to lessons or supervising practice or nagging when the child doesn't do it, that's when the parent says, okay, no more lessons. You take a similar situation where a child is learning piano and perhaps having to be nagged to practice or not enjoying it. The more proactive parents who are involved will encourage their child, find ways to motivate them, change teachers if necessary, do everything they can to keep that going, because it's a long-term pursuit. And of course, there are going to be peaks and troughs. So, when a child comes home from school and won't do their homework, the parent doesn't throw their hands up and say, okay, then you don't have to go to school anymore. Let's just drop out of school. They know that there are times when it works, when their kids are fine with it, and times when their kids are not. But the parent needs to see this activity through in so many cases. And of course, I'm talking about the majority here. There are some times where the parent's so supportive and the child is simply hating it.
Right. Yes, that's true.
Yes. And there are some cases in which the parent is unbelievably distant and absent, but somehow the child is keeping on going. But in the vast majority of cases, it's the parent that will eventually lose the motivation and interest.
Right. And so this is why we're talking about this today, because we need to keep in mind that parents need to be involved. We need to educate them, and they've got to be motivated to support their children continuing. It's a fascinating study. I'm wondering, what's your thought on the importance of having parents in lessons? We've got, down at one end of the spectrum, we've got something like Suzuki, where the parents are pretty much taught to teach their child at home, to schools where there are no parents in the lessons at all. What's your thinking on that?
That's two really, really fantastic examples there. So the Suzuki method is premised on the parent being the practice coach. So when the parent is actually supposed to learn a violin, this is what Suzuki originally envisaged, that the parent comes along, brings the child, who's usually only 3 or 4. It is the parent who is learning violin. And when the child eventually says, I want to play too, that is the moment when you start. And the parent has to know. The parent has to be able to teach that child.
You were just talking to the dog then, weren't you?
Might have been. Sorry.
It's all right.
So if you think about this, regardless of the fact that, we could talk about Suzuki all day and there are many Suzuki students who have a very poor sight reading ability. That's not what we're talking about here. The reason why Suzuki works is because the child is never expected to practice on their own. When Suzuki's taught properly, there is huge parental education to start with. They're told that they come to every lesson and they sit with their child every practice, and they are the practice coach and the teacher during the week. Now, if you put that with any method, not Suzuki playing by ear, take any method at all and have the parent educated like that and sitting with them every practice and coming to every lesson, of course it's going to work.
Right.
That will work anywhere. And the only time that might start to stop working is if the parent-child relationship is breaking down and the child really doesn't want the parent there helping them and doesn't want the parent there in the lesson, and there's if the social dynamic doesn't work, that could be a reason for not having the parent in the lesson. But I love having parents in lessons, and sometimes they're just sitting there reading a book, but they are still aware of how I'm teaching things, of what's going on. And it's when the child says, I had no time to practice this week, I can then look at the parent for confirmation or the
more
parent
often than not, no.
or more often than not, the parents rolling their eyes saying, excuse me, you had plenty of time to practice this week, you just didn't do it.
Yeah.
So parents in lessons, I feel, are fantastic. Occasionally, I've asked parents to not come if the child is growing up and they're getting into their teenage years, and I feel that the rapport between me and the student is not quite there, because sometimes when the parent's in the room, the child feels like they can't quite be themselves. And that could be a reason to either ask the parent not to come, or perhaps just to come fortnightly, or only come for the last 10 minutes of the lesson. If you've got a parent that's available, I'd say go for it. Have them in the lesson. Now, when parents aren't available, which they so often aren't, it can still work, but there needs to be communication outside the lesson. There needs to be very clear notes written, email communication with the parent if possible, and updates from term to term, and a sense, teachers need to have a sense that the parents are aware of what's going on, even if they can't oversee every moment, because they often work full time. This is the plight of 21st century parents.
I actually think having parents sitting in on lessons, and I have one who is actually going to start learning with me. She's a piano student from years ago, and I've taught her son for a number of years, and she's now asked me to teach her. I think having her sitting there actually makes me a better teacher, because I really have to be extra organized. I have to know what I'm doing, because I know that she's aware of what's going on and definitely engaged. She doesn't sit and read a book. I have other parents who do sit and read a book, other parents who drop their children off. So I like that you covered that idea of, if parents aren't in lessons, then the most important thing to do is keep them in the loop, whether that's by emails. Probably emails, I'd guess, is most relevant, because they might not have time to check the student's notebook, but trying to keep them engaged so they do feel like a part of this equation.
Absolutely.
So in regard to the parents that are in lessons, is there a way that we can bring them on board other than just sort of asking them if the student should have had time to practice and things like that? Would you suggest?
Yes, there are many different types of parents, and those who sit in on the lessons often don't need any encouragement to come on board. And in fact, sometimes they need a little bit of toning down. So if you have a parent who learned piano themselves when they were younger, they tend to come in with very preconceived ideas of what's going to happen in their child's music education. They sometimes step in and teach students, find repertoire that's inappropriate, or teach them inappropriate ways of reading things. For example, teaching them mnemonics, which we won't go into, but that's often something the parent does. And so that's like the expert parent, if you like. And then as teachers, we need to gently inspire confidence in the parent that we're going to do it our own way, whilst, of course, acknowledging that the parent had their own music education. And then there are the pushy parents who come in and say, I want my child to do grade 5 by the end of the year. This is often so many people have to deal with this. And I'm not sure what it's like in the US in the absence of the obsession in exam system like we have, but I'm sure there are pushy parents that come in and say they want their child to be this particular standard by a particular time. And they're often the ones who have overscheduled their children. So they want their child to reach a certain standard, but they haven't allocated any practice time. So that is a tricky one. And it's a matter of making them aware of what's going on at home. So this is where the progress matrix comes into it.
Tell us about that.
So if we can imagine 2 extreme scenarios where we've got, does the child practice, does the child not practice? So let's say practice is 4 or more times a week, and not practice is 3 or less times a week.
Okay.
So imagine that across the top: practice, no practice. And then along the side, going down the side, we've got either support or no support.
Right.
So support means we've got parents who are on board. If they're able to be present all the time, that's great. But you can be supportive and still work full time. And then there's the no support, where the parents are not interested or really absent without being interested. So we've got practice, no practice, and we've got support and no support. That will give us 4 quadrants. So quadrant number 1 would be lots of support and lots of practice. You're going to have success. If you've got parental support and a good practice routine, that's quadrant number 1. And I call this the exam quadrant. This is the quadrant you have to be in if you want to do an exam. And that's the end of the story. that's it. Now we go to quadrant 2, which would be there's lots of support, but there's no practice. And this is what I was talking about before with the overscheduled children. So the parent saying, yes, 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 I want Johnny to do this, that, and the other, but there's no time in the week. That's going to be very slow progress, and you can't do an exam. So the best possible progress, quadrant 1. Then quadrant 2 is pretty slow progress because there's no practice. Then you've got the no support but lots of practice quadrant. And this is also not really very successful as the exam quadrant because it's often the wrong things being practiced in the absence of support.
I see.
So there will be progress, and it's unusual. It's also very unusual for a child to keep a fabulous practice routine in the absence of support.
Yeah, particularly when they're young.
Yeah, it can happen. And then there's, of course, the last quadrant, which is no support and no practice. And there will be no progress.
That's a pretty obvious one, that one, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I've often shown this progress matrix. There's these 4 squares to parents, and I just ask them to identify which one they're in.
What a great idea. And do you do that straight up or when you see problems emerging?
Both. It works very well in the initial interview. And I'm lighthearted about it. I say, look, I'm just going to show you some extremes here. And of course, there's a whole spectrum of practice and a whole spectrum of support. But if you had to really polarize yourself, where would you put yourself? And most of the time, the student and the parent can look at it and make an honest assessment. And then the parent can choose the level of progress for their child. So if they want the fastest possible progress and they want to do exams, then they've got to be in quadrant 1. And how do you get to quadrant 1? You have to have an ironclad practice routine and you have to offer support. If you can't do those 2 things, then you're not going to be in quadrant 1. Now, you can still play piano, but you just have to have a realistic expectation of the level of progress.
Now, a quick word from our sponsor, Casio Electronic Music Instruments. As many of you will know, if you've been listening to the podcast for any length of time, I've been trialling out the Selviano Grand Hybrid Piano in my studio, and it's now become my main teaching and my own practicing instrument, and I've got to say that I'm thoroughly enjoying using it. Of course, many of you will know the benefits of a hybrid piano, including things like the recording functions you've got, the choice of different sounds, the fact that students or yourself, you can wear headphones while using it, you don't need to pay removalists to move it around your studio or house, and the fact that it never needs tuning and obviously limited maintenance. So they're all fantastic, but how does it actually sound and feel to play? Well, pretty amazing. And I'm not a concert pianist, so to me, this is absolutely as good as a full-length, normal acoustic grand piano. And it does have all the wooden keys and the normal mechanism you'd expect. So what I would really recommend you do is head to soundtechnology.com.au to find out where your local stockists of this instrument are and go and test one out today. I really believe that you'll find not only is it a fantastic instrument, but it's also at a price point that really sets it apart from its competitors. I think this is absolutely gold. I'm sure people are going to be nodding their heads and going, wow, this makes a lot of sense for those teachers out there, particularly in the Australia and UK where exams are still quite prevalent, to be able to give parents something that they can discuss with them when they start putting out these ridiculous aspirations of grades that need to be achieved in short amounts of times and things like that. I think it's absolute gold. I'm going to have to build some matrices, I think, myself as well now. You've convinced me. I've actually drawn this down. Hopefully people can picture it again. It's like a cross axis or 4 boxes with support to no support. I've done that on the vertical axis, and no practice to a good practice routine, or not practicing to practicing. Fantastic way to visualize this whole situation. Thank you for sharing it, Samantha. That's great.
It's a pleasure. And it's also a blog post that I wrote, which is called The Progress Matrix, Making Parents Responsible.
Nice.
And it breaks down what happens in each of those quadrants as well. A description of what happens. So, and yes, people can print it out and show it to their parents and have a discussion about it. And the parents who are in quadrant 1 are delighted when they see this matrix. It's very validating for them.
just as it's equally unvalidating and terrifying for parents who suddenly realize they're in quadrant 4 or somewhere else.
Yes.
Yeah, but so instructive and just great to visualize. So that's great. You've mentioned before, I've heard you talking about studio scholarships. Is that something that relates to what we're talking about today?
Yes, it absolutely is. In fact, last week when we were talking about extrinsic motivators and being positively or negatively engaged, I would say that if parents are in quadrant 4, that's kind of being negatively engaged. They're desperately trying to get out of a bad situation. But studio scholarships is a way to have parents positively engaged as well as wanting their child to have a great musical experience, of course. But I first realized that this would work as a parent motivator when parents were saying to me, well, I'm sure this happens to a lot of people. Now, I know we're only up to grade 2, but I really want him to go for the music scholarship next year. So we need to be up to grade 6 by the end of the year. And
Yes, I've experienced that.
some children manage it. The parent is very, very motivated for the child to get the scholarship. And why is that? Because it's going to save the parents a great deal of money. The child doesn't actually care whether they get the scholarship or not. There might be some kudos involved, but most times they don't really know what new school it is they might be getting into, and they don't understand the level of the monetary implications, the financial implications of winning the scholarship. All they know is mum and dad is desperate for them to win the scholarship, and mum and dad make them practice. They really make them practice and work hard. So the parent is motivated by something other than the music. So I've tried to flip this around in my studio to be very sort of to reflect positively on what happens, and I offer practice scholarships.
Right, scholarships, yeah.
Practice scholarships. Actually, I've come up with an award system now. I don't really call them practice scholarships anymore. I call them bronze, silver, and gold awards. Mm-hmm. So the bronze award will be for a student who has had a fabulous practice routine all term. I would award these from term to term. A bronze award will be a little medal or a little certificate, and yes, you've done everything I've asked you to do all term, and you've practiced so solidly, and it's a 10% off next term's fees as part of that. Now, the child likes the certificate or the medal, and the parent loves the 10% discount. And then the silver award is for people who have gone, above and beyond the call of duty, and the student has been really, really motivated and practiced super hard, and maybe even done some things I haven't written down in the book. And then that's a 20% discount off the next term fees. And I don't give those out too often. I mean, I also only give the bronze awards out, occasionally, and it's got to be for people who've really done some really good stuff. And then there's the coveted gold award, which is actually 30% off. Now that's a huge discount. It's a huge thing. And I wouldn't give that very often. But what I've done really is over the course of a term, if I were to give out, say, 6 bronze awards, that's 6 people in my studio who are going to get a 10% discount. So it's less than half a lesson a week, really, over the course of a term that I'm giving for free. And what I found is that, yes, I am cutting my income down, but just by a tiny little bit. But, oh my gosh, did the practice go up when I started offering these bronze, silver, and gold awards, because I have a newsletter that goes out each term saying who might have received a bronze award or a silver award. And the parents notice this, and they think, well, if my child practices, then they might get a bronze award, but it's really an award for the parent. And it's an acknowledgement that practice is a team effort at home. And I even do say this in the newsletter. It's practice is a team effort. There's the practice that has to be done by the actual student, but the time for that and the support for that has to be made by the parent. So it definitely is a team pursuit.
Right.
And by having the practice scholarships or the award system in my studio, I've just noticed that the standard and the frequency of practice does go up.
And that's across the board.
Across the board. I mean, there are some students who might, never practice regardless. But the thing is, it's made my job nicer. That's why I do it, because I would prefer. And this is also motivation 3.0 at work. This is like what we talked about last week. That it's not just about how much money you earn. It's about wanting a sense of satisfaction in what you do. So I would prefer to earn slightly less and have a much better time with all of my students because they all practice more. Now, the fees remain the same, but to offer a discount for hard work comes across differently than just not putting your fees up and hoping that everybody will stay motivated.
It's such in reality, it's a very simple concept, but I'm sure very few of us have even thought to do it. And you're right; it's just such a great way to motivate the parents. But I like that you also give the child a medal or a trophy or whatever it is too. I think that's a really nice touch, and great to hear a practical solution that any teacher listening could potentially incorporate in order to engage those parents more. So thank you so much for sharing and being so willing to share your great ideas, Samantha. It's fantastic.
That's a pleasure.
So look, I think we should probably wrap up today. So just going over some of the main points we talked about, we were talking about the study from Professor McPherson here at the Melbourne Conservatorium, I think, who was talking about mostly it's about parents that give up music, not their children. So we started on that line. We were talking about parents as the practice coach and how we need to keep encouraging the parents. And then you shared with us the progress matrix, which we're going to make sure we have a copy of available through the show notes, and talking about that as a tool whereby parents can see exactly where they're at and teachers can, and it can become a really great talking point, both at the start of lessons and also perhaps when students are struggling with their motivation a little bit. And then we finished by talking about this idea of studio or practice scholarships, although I noticed that you don't call them that now. They're just awards, aren't they?
Yes.
Bronze, silver, and gold awards, which by offering a discount for parents, and I assume that discount starts the following year after it's awarded, is that right?
It's term by term.
Right.
So we have 4 terms in a year in Australia. So it's for the following 10 weeks. The way I do it is I send out the newsletter saying, and here are the awards for last term, and those people are going to get blah, 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 and that's off the following term's discount. So it also, the following term's invoice. That ensures they come back as well.
Right.
So that basically lasts for 10 weeks. And I did have one student last year who got a bronze award every single term.
I was going to ask about that. If they get one once, do they often keep it or do they sometimes come in and out?
The ones who get it will get it more often than not.
Mm-hmm.
But I do try to share it around a little bit, but there are some who have never got one, but that's okay. They know that they probably don't really deserve one. Most students in my studio have received at least a bronze award at some stage, and that also has to do with probably my own practice policy. And I do have a very blunt policy.
Right.
When you pair it right back, and that is no practice equals no lessons.
Mm. We've got to be strong on those things sometimes.
Yes. Again, that just comes down to parent education. And just to sum up briefly about that Gary McPherson study that we talked about, what he found was that because he did the study over 14 years, the students who played their instruments for longer were the ones who practiced more. And the students who received more support from their parents were the ones who practiced more, and therefore they played their instruments longer. So more parental support equals more practice, which equals sticking at your instrument longer, which means you ultimately have music in your life. And that's why the book is called Music in Our Lives, because he was talking about the students who ultimately had music in their life long term were the ones who practiced more when they were younger, and that's because they had more support when they were younger. So for parents who really what we should be saying to parents, I think, is, do you like the thought that your child will keep playing piano when they're adults long after lessons have stopped? And they say, oh, yes, of course. Why would I be doing it otherwise? And that's really the crux of the matter, that things have to be sustainable and enjoyable now.
Great way to summarize it. Thank you so much, Samantha, for sharing so many great ideas. Again, I'm can't wait for part 3 now. Can you give us a quick overview of what we were talking about in the last part of this series?
Yes, well, we'll be talking about something called self-determination theory, which sounds very fancy.
It does,
but it basically really is so sensible when you pare it back. There are 3 psychological needs, and they are called autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And this is what self-determination theory is, and this can be related really well to piano students and to just musicians in general and human beings in general. So we'll be talking about that.
I feel like I'm getting a little mini MBA or something here in student motivation, which is exactly what I wanted. So thanks again, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Tim. See you next week.
Wow, I really hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. It's just so great hanging out with Samantha. I do hope you've enjoyed it. And make sure, anytime you hear about her speaking, make sure you get along to it, because you will be blown away. I guarantee it, as you can tell. Also, make sure you check out her blog at Blitz Books too. I'm sure you can Google it and find out more. All right, now webinar reminders next week, Wednesday the 28th of March here in Melbourne, 8 a.m. time. That's Tuesday afternoon and evening for you guys in the United States and London. It's my webinar all about inspiring adults. It's a topic I haven't talked a huge amount about before, but I have a lot of experience in, and as you know, I teach a lot of teenagers and older students. So I'm going to be giving away a whole lot of my tips about ways to keep those adults inspired. Head to timtopham.com/webinar to find out more and to sign up. Hopefully we'll see you there. All right, next week on the podcast, it's our last episode for season number 1, 2018, and it's part 3 of this fantastic series on motivation with Samantha Coates. Next week, we're talking about the 3 basic needs of all piano students and how that relates to the goals you set and the repertoire you choose. I'm Tim Topham, and this is the Creative Piano Teaching Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week.
Ladies and gentlemen, that will conclude this evening's entertainment.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Creative Piano Teaching Podcast. We'd love to help take your teaching to the next level as a member of our supportive community. Use the coupon Piano Podcast for $100 off an annual membership of Tim's Inner Circle today. To find out more, head to timtopham.com/community.